So the second time I visited you here at St. Timothy's, when most of you didn't know what you were in for, I confessed that I had never actually finished reading the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Do you remember that? Strange for a professional librarian, I know. And some of you rightly gasped in mock horror, and that's when I knew we were going to get along just fine. Well, I'm going to make another literary confession today. I have never finished reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I know, shocking. I picked it up recently again, and one of the first things that happens in the book is that Huckleberry Finn escapes from the top-story bedroom where a kind widow and her rather stern sister have given Huck sleeping quarters with the hopes that they can reform him. But Huck Finn just can't stand to sleep in a normal bed in a nice house. Why? Because he's a wild child. That's why. How do we know he's wild? Just because he escapes from his bedroom? No. It's because we have read the first book, the prequel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Well done. 5 points for all of you. We know from the earlier part of the story that Tom's main characteristic is a streak of criminality. He's a bad boy. And we don't get far into the adventures of Huckleberry Finn before Tom proves that to be absolutely true. He assembles a gang with Finn and others. He plans murders and robberies all in his imagination, but still, a little bit of criminal. Now, if you hadn't read Tom Sawyer, but started with Huck Finn and read as far as Tom's plotting, you might conclude that Tom is the wild one. But no, Finn is the wild child. So let's apply this same thought experiment to John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth as they're portrayed in the opening of Mark's Gospel. Who would you say is the wilder one? John or Jesus? At first blush, John seems to be the stranger one, doesn't he? Possibly because his strangeness is condensed into a few short verses in which he yells a lot, wears odd clothing, eats strange food, and lives in the wilderness. Or perhaps we feel John is the more unfamiliar one of the two because we've heard more stories told about Jesus and heard lots of teaching by Jesus. So we might feel that our picture of Jesus is more rounded than that of John's. And it's true that the verisimilitude, I love that word, the realness of a rounded character like John against a more stereotypical bit piece character like John, I meant a rounded character like Jesus, against a more stereotypical bit character like John, makes us feel like Jesus is more familiar, less strange. But I want to propose a thesis today, and that is this. Between John and Jesus, Jesus is the stranger one. Jesus was the stranger one because he was God. And God is more other to us than John, who was, after all, a mere human. Only Jesus, of all the billions who have lived in the history of the world, was both God and human. And how, or from what source, other than the Gospels, do we know the truth of what God is like? The Old Testament. The Old Testament reveals not only what God is like, but what Jesus will be like in the Gospels. It's like reading Tom Sawyer before Huck Finn, so that you know who the wilder stranger one actually is. But in case you're not convinced, let me attempt to prove this using today's Gospel text. Now, I'm riffing off a sermon title today from a book title named Jesus, Mean and Wild: The Unexpected Love of an Untamable God by former Christianity Today author Mark Galli. And I promise this is the last book that I'll flash today. His book is entitled Jesus, Mean and Wild. My sermon title, and the picture that I'm going to spend some time painting this afternoon, is Jesus, Meek and Wild. Jesus, meek and wild. Jesus praying in a desolate place shows us his meekness, while his healing of the leper shows us some of his wildness. Jesus in the desolate place is meekness. The healing of the leper shows us some of Jesus' wildness. Well, if you were listening really closely last week and this week to the gospel reading, you'll notice there was a little bit of overlap. Today we began our gospel text in the place we left off last week. Last week our gospel reading ended in the place we began today, with the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. How appropriate for last Sunday, it being Mother's Day. Remember how she was healed immediately of her fever, which means the healing at Jesus' hands was so complete that not only her symptoms disappeared, but her strength immediately returned. How many of you have had a fever of some sort? High, low, or in between? Yeah. Recall how weak you felt for days afterwards? Not Peter's mother-in-law. Immediately, Mark's favorite word, utus, immediately, she returns to her role as household hostess, which, as we saw last week, was a place of honor for her, not work. And she would need that strength for the hustle and bustle of Peter's house once word started getting out that Jesus was curing people on the spot. Okay, second question for you today. Has anyone here visited Capernaum in the Holy Land in Israel? Marilyn, I see that hand. Now, Peter's house in Capernaum wasn't a West Coast box like we see all around the Lower Mainland. It was rather a mini compound, focused in on the middle. Like many houses of the period, it had a courtyard with multiple hearths for cooking and stairs up to the rooftops, where on a hot sunny night, which is many nights in the Middle East, they would go up to the roof to sleep. Multiple generations would have lived here. So it was no little hovel, but still it couldn't accommodate all the townspeople and everyone within shouting distance who brought their sick to be healed by Jesus. And he did heal many sick and demon-possessed people that night. Many, in case you're wondering, is a Hebrew way of saying all. Okay? It doesn't mean that of all those who came to see him, he just picked a few to heal. No. Those who were healed were many. Everyone who was sick was healed. That's a good day's work, even if you're the Son of God. With all that power going out from him, he must have been tired and deserved a good night's sleep. But in our gospel text, Mark reports that Jesus did not sleep the whole night. Without the assistance of an alarm or an iPhone, what Jesus does is odd indeed, writes Mark Galli. It should not surprise us that Jesus, a man of prayer even more so than the saints, who, like John the Baptist, are merely humans, after all, it should not surprise us that Jesus will act oddly sometimes. Before the sun rises, he disappears from Peter's house. Why? Why would he do this? Is he a morning person? Now, I wouldn't call myself a morning person, but compared to my lovely wife, Sherry, well, I well remember the morning where I must have been a bit too chatty because she looked up from her Bible and asked me, "Why are you talking?" I stopped talking at that point. Why does Jesus disappear here? Is he an introvert like me? Or possibly like some of you? Does he need time to recharge? No, it's a lot simpler than that. He needed to pray. I can imagine Jesus agreeing wholeheartedly with Julian of Norwich's exclamation, whose feast day we observed last week, if you follow the church calendar. She writes, "I saw him and I sought him. I had him, yet I wanted him. I had him, yet I wanted him." This humble dependence of Jesus, the Son of God, on the Father demonstrates his meekness. We have a God who is not ashamed to need the other members of the Trinity. What does that mean for us? So St. Timothy's, I'm just getting to know you. But I want to ask you, I want to challenge us. Are we people of prayer? Do we feel a need to pray? If not, why not? Jesus was the Son of God, God himself, and he was driven to pray. It would stand to reason then that we who are not gods, last time I checked, would have even more need to pray than Christ did. No, Jesus also prayed out of need, but his need was a need to maximize the unbroken communion that he had with the Father and the Spirit. More on that next week, which is Trinity Sunday. And Jesus exercises further meekness, and it has to be said, patience, as he resists the disciples who have suddenly located him. Now, the verb that the NIV translates as looking for is never used positively in Mark's gospel. Whenever people look for Jesus in Mark, they are trying to exploit him, manipulate him, and use him. This posse of disciples hunting him down are no different. And the word that Mark uses here is the same word that the Greek version of the Old Testament uses for Saul chasing after David. And what did Saul want to do to David? Kill him. What a success last night was, his disciples might have said. Come back to Capernaum, Lord, and we can capitalize on your success. More healings, more people, more fame. More. And Jesus does want more, but not more of that. Not more of being a wonder worker. His hours of early morning prayer have reset his compass, and he knows what he has to do. Go on to the next towns so that he can preach there, for that is why he came out. His words exactly. I came to preach. Let's move on. Second passage in our gospel text is the healing of the leper. Now, if you have a study Bible, you might notice a little note saying this is not the leprosy that is still widespread in some parts of the world. Right? That's technically known as Hansen's disease. It's the wasting disease, which looks roughly the same. But in ancient Near Eastern times, any kind of skin condition was considered leprosy. In fact, even the walls in your house, if there was some sort of mildew, that was considered leprosy. And whether it was on skin or walls or in a bowl or anywhere, it was unclean. Now remember, we saw Jesus first healing the mother-in-law's fever. What I didn't mention last week is that when he raises her up, he literally rebukes the fever like a demon. And then we saw him praying and preaching. And now we see him with the leper healing again. And this format in Mark has a really technical name. It's called the sandwich format. Sorry if I made you hungry there. This sandwich format is very common in Mark. He uses it often. The most common sandwiches are the ones where he tells part of the story, that's top of the sandwich. Then he turns his attention to something else entirely. Different people, different setting. That's the meat of the sandwich. And then he returns to the original part of the story to finish it off. That's the bread on the bottom. Bread, meat, bread, sandwich. Healing and or exercising Peter's mother-in-law. Praying and preaching. And then healing again. That's the structure we have here. And I'll spend just a moment on it, because we'll see it throughout the Gospel of Mark. And in this particular instance, it serves to highlight the importance of the middle part, which is the praying and the preaching. But even though the praying and the preaching is the most important part, it's the healing of the leper that shows us the wild side of Jesus of Nazareth. First the meek, now the wild. Now, you heard me reading the gospel text earlier. You might be asking, where's the wild here? Where's the wild? What I see in this passage, you may be saying, is Jesus allowing a man with an incurable skin condition to approach him. He listens to the man. He allows him to be touched. Power goes out from him healing the disease, and then he sends the man on his way. And you would be right, that's the base plot. Yeah, all that's wild about that is that the man was cured miraculously. And if you know the law of Moses, it's also pretty wild that Jesus allowed the unclean man to touch him in the first place. Those with these types of skin conditions are supposed to yell, unclean, unclean to passersby and not approach them, let alone touch them. And it's also wild that Jesus pronounces him clean, because Jesus is not a priest. And pronouncing a person clean of leprosy is a priest's job, and that's all the way in the Jerusalem temple, which is far away from Galilee. So, hold on. This is sounding wilder and wilder, isn't it? And there's more that you can only see clearly in the original Greek. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I'll limit it to two, but I want to take them in reverse order. Where the English text reads, Jesus sternly charged him, the literal meaning is to denounce harshly, to scold, to drive away. Pretty strong, pretty wild. And before that, where our ESV translates Jesus' feelings as moved with pity, and other translations render it as compassion, there's ambiguity about what that phrase actually means. Now again, Mark uses ambiguous language often. Here it literally means moved in the internal organs. Take your pick of organ. I'm not going to expand on that here. Point is, it's an indication of intense emotion. But it's intensified because Mark's meaning is ambiguous, or perhaps better said, he's using a double meaning. It's a little joke. It's not a funny joke, but it's a joke. It's a play on words. No doubt Jesus felt pity or compassion for the man, but that's a translational interpretation, as all interpretations are. Another interpretation, another translation, the one that's used less often, is this. When Jesus was filled with intense emotion, he was indignant. Indignant. What might that mean? Was it indignant? Or was it compassion? Why couldn't it be both? Compassion towards the man, because indignant about the man's condition as a result of the curse of the fall. This reflects the triune Godhead's settled, continuous, and simultaneous dispositions of compassion towards fallen humanity, as well as indignation or anger or wrath against what's wrong with the world. As you'll hear me say many times from this lectern and often in conversation, the world is fallen, and it often falls on us. But Christ has come to reverse the effects of the fall, and the healings in Mark's gospel are like lights in the distance, drawing nearer, signs of a better future. We could call them portents of Pentecost, which, as I mentioned at the outset of the service, we celebrate today in the church calendar. The message that God was keeping, his promise, was to come and save the world through his Son. And Jesus said exactly that about his mission when his disciples found him in the desolate place. I came to preach. So the signs and wonders are all well and good, but they're beside the point. They point to the message, not the other way around. We are to focus on the message, not the signs. And so on Pentecost, we continue the mission of Christ in the power of the Spirit. How do we do that? Same as Christ. We preach the gospel. Amen.